Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Говорит Москва.
If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to True Spies Debrief. Journalist Gordon Corera is a seasoned writer and reporter on politics, intelligence, and security matters on both sides of the Atlantic. His latest book, The Spy in the Archive, spans over 100 years of history and weaves together some of the most intriguing tales of Cold War espionage. The common thread? KGB librarian Vasili Mitrokhin. This week, Gordon joins True Spies producer Morgan Childs to discuss Mitrokhin's extraordinary life and the continued relevance of the warning bells he rang for his fellow Russians and for the West.
Thank you, Gordon. I have to say I was quite moved by your book, in part because its scope is so vast, and also because its relevance today is sort of disturbingly immediate. So I'm glad to have you. Your book is about someone that a lot of True Spies listeners have heard about, but for anyone who might not remember or who hasn't got their hands on the book yet, who was Vasili Mitrokhin?
Well, he was an archivist, a quiet, introverted, obsessive archivist, but an archivist, or a librarian, if you like, for the KGB, for the Soviet Union's secret police. And I think that made him an extraordinary figure, actually, in intelligence history. This quiet, slightly unusual, occasionally eccentric man actually ended up revealing more of the secrets of the Soviet Union and its spy service than anyone else. And for that reason, I think he deserves a real place in espionage history. And his story, I think, is an incredibly rich one because it's a story about an individual who does something extraordinary, but it also shines this light on the history of the Soviet Union and its intelligence services from their origin through their entire life and through to the extent to which they still play a role and persist today in modern Russia.
So before you delved into this project, which I can tell involved quite a great deal of research and interviews, it seems, what was your awareness of Mitrokhin? What was your relationship with him?
Well, I never met him, which is to my great regret. I wish I had. He died, about 20 years ago. I remember as a young journalist, very young journalist in the late 90s, when his name first emerged, 1999, this strange story appeared about an archivist from the KGB who'd suddenly gone public, and there was a book, this famous book, which he co-authored with Christopher Andrew, the kind of British intelligence historian, revealing some of the secrets of his archive and going public. But it was actually only when I went back to it in the last few years, and I looked at the issue of Russian illegals for my previous book. And so I went to look at the Mitrokhin archive in Cambridge and try and understand what it told us about Russian illegals, deep cover spies, because I was writing about them. And then suddenly kind of looked at this archive and thought, this is extraordinary. And what is the story behind it? What is the story of how someone could create an archive of the KGB's deepest secrets? And I also learned from some sources that there was an interesting story to tell about how he'd got out. And I suddenly thought, well, here is a figure whose name is known to people in the intelligence world because of the publication of that book about his files, but who the man himself and how he came to have access to that material and how it got to the West. That story had never been told. And of course, like any writer or journalist, when you see an interesting story which hasn't been told, immediately you think, I wonder if I could tell that. I wonder if I could get to it. There's one left. Can I get to that story? Yeah. And then it took me quite a few years to get to it, but I think I got there in the end, as much as I could at least.
I think a lot of our listeners, myself included, have a sort of working knowledge of Cold War history, but not as much of a grip on the early days of the Soviet Union. And also their sort of lingering influence on Russia today. So could you perhaps walk us through maybe the founding of the Cheka and what we now call Czechism and how it sort of evolved out of that?
Yes, and I think this was one of the things I understood is you could tell the history of the KGB through the eyes of Vasili Mitrokhin and his story. But more importantly, something which you rightly settle on there, which is Czechism, the Cheka, Czechist. These are kind of interesting terms which have entered common currency, but actually it's through Mitrokhin you can really understand what Czechism is. Now, the Cheka itself those are the initials for the All-Revolutionary Committee to Combat Sabotage and Counter-Revolution in the early days of the Soviet Union. So it's founded by Lenin right after the revolution.
Cheka being the transliterated initials, yes?
Exactly, the transliterated initials of this initial secret service for the Bolsheviks under this important figure, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who I think it's worth coming back to because he is also a very important figure in this story. And I think right from the start, it's clear the Cheka is not an intelligence service in the way Western people think of intelligence service. It is, if you like, a counter-revolutionary security service designed to defeat all the enemies that the Bolsheviks see all around them. And right from the start, the Bolsheviks see all these threats to the new revolution. They see the threats at home from kind of white elements of the old regime. They see it from abroad. They see the British secret services they imagine plotting against them. They see enemies everywhere, including in their own ranks. And so right from the start, the Chekists have a kind of certain degree of paranoia. Some of it is actually legitimate because there are a lot of threats to the revolution and a willingness to use extreme violence to preserve the revolution and to go after the enemies. And this is, if you like, at the core of the kind of Chekist identity from those early days. And you get this kind of the Red Terror, which is inflicted in those early years, which is incredibly violent under Dzerzhinsky. And, Lenin and Dzerzhinsky themselves talk about Chekists being a revolutionary terrorist organization, and actually terror, the infliction of terror on the population, being part of what is needed to defeat the enemies and preserve the revolution. So right from the start there, you have a very specific kind of founding notion of what the Cheka and the Chekist is. And they have also quite a kind of romantic notion of themselves as the great heroes protecting the revolution. And Dzerzhinsky is this kind of noble, almost mythic, saint-like, knight-like figure working in the Lubyanka to do whatever it took to preserve the revolution. So there's a kind of myth to it that goes along with the violence. Mm-hmm. Now, the Cheka itself, as an organization, technically disappears after a few years. And it becomes the OGPU, and then the NKVD, then the MGB. It goes through all these different names and eventually becomes the KGB. But what's interesting to me is that people continue to refer to themselves as Chekists.
Yes. Yeah.
And they continue in those days to call themselves Chekists right through this history. And today, Putin and many of those around him think of themselves and talk of themselves as Chekists. Mm. So there is something about this Chekist identity which is integral to understanding, I think, Soviet and Russian intelligence, and which is created by Dzerzhinsky and Lenin in those early days, and which, persists as both myth and reality for decades onwards and shapes, I think, the trajectory of both the Soviet Union and Russia.
And Mitrokhin is born in 1922, is that right?
Yeah.
And so could you sort of map his youth and his early adulthood onto this timeline?
And that's what's interesting. He's almost born into this revolutionary world where the civil war, which rages across Russia in the years after the revolution, is just dying down. Mitrokhin is born in the countryside, in a peaceful village, although, of course, the countryside has been fought over by different armies over the years. So it's just emerging out of this period of violence. And Mitrokhin himself, born to a relatively kind of poor peasant background. His father was a kind of painter, decorator. He was not someone from a aristocratic, a noble, or even a middle class or intelligentsia background. To some extent, his trajectory was only possible under communism, under a Soviet Union which had broken the old class structures and allowed him to rise up into the establishment. And so through his early years, he's not in the secret state. His family are not in the secret state. And he's actually a student and an archivist who goes for training when he's 18 or so at the Moscow Institute for Historical Archives. And it's interesting because also then again, events intervene, because at that point, the Second World War breaks out. The Nazis invade the Soviet Union. The archives are evacuated. His kind of education, if you like, is disrupted. And he ends up going down a different path and becoming a prosecutor, working with the Soviet police, particularly in Ukraine at the end of the war, which is, for him, is something he never wanted to talk about in later years. All he would say was, I saw horrors. And the horrors were as the Soviet Union reimposed control over Ukraine after it had pushed the Nazis out of Ukraine. And there was intense violence there, which I think Mitrokhin himself was involved in. But that job then offers him a gateway eventually to join what we now call the KGB.
On February 13th, Crime 101 hits theaters.
What is it that you do?
I take high-value items and make them disappear.
So you're a thief.
This guy's a ghost. There's no DNA. He's in and out in seconds.
Your guy's untraceable.
Chris Hemsworth, Mark Ruffalo, Barry Keoghan, and Halle Berry. One crime connects them all.
We're good at this.
Yeah.
Crime 101, directed by Bart Layton. Rated R, under 17 on admitted without parent. Only in theaters February 13th.
AI is incredible. It can teach you how to fry an egg and even write a poem, pirate style. Yarr! But it knows nothing about your work. Slackbot is different. It doesn't just know the facts. It knows your schedule. It can turn a brainstorm into a brief. And it doesn't need to be taught. Because Slackbot isn't just another AI. It's AI that knows your work as well as you do. Visit slack.com/meet Slackbot to learn more.
He says, I saw horrors, which seems as though he was a witness to something. But indeed, yes, you write in the book, the fact that he could not talk about it for the rest of his life was not just because of what he had witnessed, but because he had been an intrinsic part of it. This is in regard to the horrible acts committed by the Stalinist regime in the early 1940s and the end of the war, as I understand it.
He was part of it. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Mitrokhin, is that he is a willing part of it at that point. He is seeing this extreme violence. Basically, the Soviet Union was worried about there being kind of partisans, nationalists who had sided with the Germans to, if you like, push out the Soviet Union out of Ukraine, and therefore wanted to hunt them down. And, there was just an extreme level of violence and retribution against some of those kind of partisans and nationalists in Ukraine who were kind of murdered, their bodies left on the streets, families killed, they were hunted down. And I think what's so interesting is that Mitrokhin, as a prosecutor at that time, would have been part of that machine of repression and violence. So he, all through his life, I think what's important is he understood the KGB and the Chekists in a way that no one else could, because he had been part of it, because he had lived it, and because actually he had been a true believer in it. He'd been a true believer in communism and would be in the kind of, initially at least, in that Chekist ideology, that these were the people who did what it took to preserve the revolution and protect the motherland.
Does he act out of guilt?
I think ultimately, there is an element of guilt to it. I think motivation is so interesting and so complex with Mitrokhin, because he's going to go into the KGB and into its first chief directorate and still be a kind of, I think, excited about being the chance to spy abroad, to be a spy abroad. But I think there will also be elements of guilt when he looks back at what he did in his early career, whether it was in Ukraine as a prosecutor or in his early career as a KGB, which drives him. Guilt, anger, ideology, a complicated cocktail, I think, in his mind is going to motivate him to eventually turn against his employers.
And you write about how it was a failure that landed him the role that now has made him famous. Can you speak about that failure?
Yeah, it's so interesting because he gets into the first chief directorate of the KGB. And the truth is, people who knew him would say this, he was not a natural spy. He was the first chief directorate is the equivalent of the CIA or Britain's MI6, who are out there supposed to be spying abroad, recruiting agents abroad on the diplomatic cocktail party circuit. he was not a natural at that. He was too introverted. He was not great company. He was not good at light conversation and those kind of things. He was not good also at playing the office politics in the KGB. And he had a couple of foreign postings, one to Israel, which did not go well. And there were some compromises in Israel, which, whether he was to blame or not, it was seen as a kind of failed posting. Then he gets some short-term postings. One, bizarrely, is to Australia. And he accompanies the Soviet Olympic team to Australia, to Melbourne in 1956. And again, this goes wrong. There's a kind of a near riot after the Soviet players, who Mitrokhin is supposed to be kind of looking over and guarding and watching, in a water polo match, get into pretty much a fight with the Hungarian players, because the Budapest uprising, the Hungarian uprising, has just taken place, and there's kind of anger between the two sets of players. Mitrokhin again kind of gets the blame for this.
Well, it's a huge PR disaster. I mean, it's a
huge PR disaster because it's on. It's on. There's pictures of it. You can still find the pictures of it. You're right.
A bloody
blood in the water. Of the polo game, the water polo game, because it gets out of control. And Mitrokhin had been there as an undercover KGB officer, supposed to keep track of, and to stop any problems. So you can see what happens is his bosses in the first chief director at the KGB go, this guy is not up to it. He's not right for it. He's not suited to the work. And on his file gets stamped the terrible words for a spy, not suitable for operational work. So what do you do with a person like that? Well, they don't want to sack him. That wasn't the kind of way things were done. They remembered he trained as an archivist. They think, banish him to the archives, send him to the archives. And so straight after Australia, he's sent to the archives, and it's punishment. It is an exile. I often think it is one of the worst human resources personnel decisions in history, to send this obsessive man into the archives, thinking it's punishment, when in fact he will, wreak his revenge on the KGB and his employers, and use the access and what he sees in the archive to try and destroy them.
Yeah, and you make the excellent point that once he's there, he's sort of rediscovering a talent and a passion that he had as a young person.
Yeah, he's a natural archivist. He's naturally good at it. One other thing I find interesting is he gets sent into the archives in 1956 into literally the belly, the basement of the Lubyanka where the archives are. But it is still years before he actually starts to do anything. I mean, it seems to be as many as 16 years in the archives before he starts to do what he's going to do, which is copy the files. And so I also found this part of the journey fascinating, because this interplay between what's going on in his head and events in the outside world and what he sees in the archive, because he's there kind of unhappy in the archives, kind of stewing effectively. But he's also watching changes in the Soviet Union. He's watching the kind of rise and fall of some freedoms for artists and writers, and then them getting clamped down on. He's watching the Prague Spring in 1968, and then seeing that at this moment when some hoped that there might be a more liberal, democratic, open form of communism, it gets stamped on by the Soviet Union, crushed. And he's watching these events, and he's watching dissidents being crushed by the Soviet Union. And of course, because he's in the archive, he can see in the files what the KGB is really doing. So he has this access and insight into the reality of the Soviet Union, which no one else has. So it's this combination of outside events, his own access to the truth of what the KGB does, all kind of building in his mind and turning him effectively into one of the dissidents he admires, but a secret dissident inside the archive. But that is going to take years. It's this really long journey of about 16 years before he actually gets the opportunity in the moment where he thinks, I'm now ready and I have the chance to do something about this growing anger. And he's quite, he's an obsessive character. He's introverted. He sees himself as almost like a kind of hero in a Russian peasant folk story. He has engaging in a spiritual battle against forces of evil. Very intense, I think, as a character.
Can we talk about the Gulag archipelago? Because that's such a fascinating part of your book, and also a way of sort of looking at Mitrokhin's motivations. Solzhenitsyn's book was published in 1973, but it was circulated in samizdat until the end of the Soviet Union. What did Solzhenitsyn reveal about the heart of the Russian people that really mirrored Mitrokhin's story?
I think Solzhenitsyn is such an interesting and important character. Of all the writers in the 20th century, I think he's up there with George Orwell and some of the others who wrote, novels and literature which shaped politics and political life. And Solzhenitsyn had been in the Gulag himself, in the Soviet labor camps, at the end of the war, having been in the Red Army. I think Mitrokhin himself will see parallels between his own experience and that of Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn will then, during one of those brief periods of openness, publish a novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is about the camps, and then get set to work on a kind of non-fiction, truthful account based on lots of people he talks to of what the reality was in the gulags, in the camps. And it's so interesting because I think Solzhenitsyn influences Mitrokhin very much, because Solzhenitsyn is there as someone who believes it is his duty to preserve the truth of what happened, and who views the truth as a weapon against the lies on which the Soviet Union has been built, and views his duty as being to expose the truth and record the truth. And also, Solzhenitsyn works on the Gulag archipelago secretly and buries his notes and hides his notes because he doesn't know whether he'll be able to publish it or how he'll be able to publish it. So for years, the manuscript is kind of hidden, buried in gardens and places like that. And that is exactly what Mitrokhin will do. And it is this kind of, Christopher Andrews talked about this as well, this Russian idea of writing for the drawer, which means you write without knowing whether it could ever be published because the work is too dangerous. So you write and you put it in a drawer and you lock it away in the hope that one day you might be able to publish it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what Solzhenitsyn did with the Gulag archipelago. And that is what Mitrokhin will decide he will do with his archive and his work. He will, if you like, mirror that. But whereas Solzhenitsyn was talking about the gulags and the labor camps and revealing the truth of what happened there, Mitrokhin is going to want to write about the KGB and what happened inside it. And he will share some of the ideology of Solzhenitsyn, some of the kind of nationalistic aspects, some of the anti-communist aspects which are rooted in Russian folk peasant traditions and the countryside. And so there's kind of interesting parallels I found between the two figures.
We should say later in his life, Mitrokhin, he wants to write, but he wants to write, not only for the West, the people that he's sharing information with, but he wants to write for his fellow Russians.
Yes, that is his first desire, is to create a testimony of the truth of what the KGB did to its own people, not for Western spies, but for the Russian people. He has this view that the KGB, the Cheka, is a kind of monster which has fed on the soul of Russia and its people. Mm-hmm. And he actually sees a kind of three-headed monster, one head being the Communist Party, one being the nomenclatura, the elite, and another being the Chekists, but it all being kind of one creature which is feeding on the soul of Russia and of its people. And he wants to destroy that monster. And he believes that his secret archive, by creating a secret archive, he can create something of a weapon. And the way the weapon will be wielded is by revealing the truth to the Russian people, and them then coming to an understanding of what this creature had done to them, and also, perhaps even repenting of their own kind of involvement in it to some extent, which you can see is also partly his own guilt as well as having been part of it himself. I think that's definitely part of that motivation. And a strong part was not to be a spy for the West. Mm-hmm. The book is called The Spy in the Archive, but in many ways, when he was in the archive, he didn't see himself as a spy, I think. He will become one in some ways, but he's much more of a dissident. He's a dissident like many other dissidents in the Soviet Union, just a very secret one whose place was not in the public domain, but in the secret archive of the KGB, but with the hope of bringing it to light.
So tell us about how he begins to smuggle out reams and reams and reams of paper and store it away, tuck it away.
It's an amazing story. This is the bit I still find, bizarre and extraordinary, because he's going to risk his life doing this, and he's going to realise around 1972 that there's an opportunity to act on this impulse he has of trying to fight the KGB, his own master, because the KGB's first chief directorate is moving house, and it's moving from the Lubyanka in the centre of Moscow to its new place, where it still is, in the woods, Yasnevo, in the forest on the outskirts of Moscow, just the first chief directorate. So they're going to move the files. He, as an archivist, has got to move the files, and he's got to decide which files get moved, which ones get weeded, which ones stay. So they're all going to pass through his office. And he suddenly realised, well, I have this opportunity to copy them. To look at this entire archive is going to pass through my hands. And he quite simply sits in his office and on a tiny sheet of paper, initially tiny kind of scraps of paper, will make notes in his own coded handwriting, kind of like shorthand, but his own shorthand kind of code. And he will then tuck those pieces of paper into his shoe. Mm-hmm. And just walk out of the KGB headquarters with them in his shoe. And it's so interesting because, he understands how security works there. And of course, you couldn't walk out with a big bulky file. Someone's going to spot that. But if you copy it and then take it home and then reconstitute that scrap into a file by using your memory and using your notes to create a file that way, then you can effectively steal the archive, because you're not quite stealing it, you're copying it. The problem is this takes, this is not a simple procedure. He's going to do this for 12 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, 12 years of doing this every day, risking his life. I mean, I find it extraordinary. I find it even more extraordinary when he hasn't even got a plan with what he's going to do with it. He's going to his apartment in Moscow and his dachas outside of Moscow, writing it up, turning it back into a file, these scraps, and then hiding them in milk churns or steel containers under the floorboards of the dacha, but without actually a plan of what to do with it. It goes back to this kind of obsessive, introverted archivist nature, where he is driven by this, I think, compulsion to do this and to preserve the truth without really having been tasked to do it by an intelligence agency or anyone else. It's kind of an extraordinary thing to do, I think.
Of course, the story of how all of this makes its way to MI6 and how they make sense of the fact that these are not original documents and, they're written in a sort of code. All of this is fascinating in its own right. And I think maybe for the sake of time, I'll leave it to listeners to look at your narrative, which is so beautifully constructed. But I would like to ask you about a couple of the sort of major plot points that Mitrokhin's story intersects with in the lives of some of the other most famous spies, some of the names that True Spies listeners might already be aware of. One of them is the illegal Jack Barsky, who appeared on the show a couple of years ago. Could you tell us a bit about him? Yeah,
so Jack Barsky was a East German, but recruited by the KGB to be an illegal and to go spy in America. And it's a wonderful story. I've spoken to Jack many times, and he's such an interesting man. But he basically works and is not discovered by the FBI or by the American authorities, even after he's effectively kind of cut his links with the KGB, and he's living there. And then Mitrokhin will come out in 1992 with his files. And suddenly the FBI and the US, when they get hold of the files, look at this and they go, there are volumes and volumes of an agent who was inside the United States who we never knew about. Mm-hmm. And so it's Mitrokhin who will set them on to Barsky, because there are enough details in the files that Mitrokhin has collected, because he has access to some of the documents surrounding the most secret spies the KGB had, which are the deep cover illegals. They will eventually get onto him and confront Jack Barsky, and he will confess. And it's interesting talking to Jack, because, I said to him, how do you feel about Mitrokhin? Because he effectively blew up your life, because you were living under a new identity, in the US. And then suddenly you're arrested by him. And he said, in a way, he's grateful to Mitrokhin. It sounds strange, because he allowed him to, as he put it, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. He was all these pieces. And by having it exposed and having to kind of confront the past and talk to the FBI, he was able to kind of do a deal and create a new life. It's kind of fascinating in a way. But that is just one example of, Mitrokhin revealed so many details of spies. I mean, some whom Western intelligence had no idea about, including in Britain, including in America, but a huge number around the world, because he'd stolen KGB files about France, about India, about Italy, about Africa. And one of the problems was just the sheer volume of cases that came out of the Mitrokhin archive, which were overwhelmed, some intelligence services, including, I think, to some extent, Britain's MI5, and posed lots of problems, because in some countries were not very happy when they were told, by the way, you had a load of spies you didn't know about inside the French Foreign Ministry or somewhere else.
Mitrokhin, again, he insisted that his information be published in some form, and that was a key stipulation to MI6. And that finally happened in 1999, as you've mentioned. He was left unsatisfied. Why was that the case?
Yeah, this was one bit I found quite sad and quite difficult, actually, which I learned in researching and writing the book was it was quite a painful period. I mean, MI6 extracted him, exfiltrated him in 1992 with a deal to get his family out and also that they would publish the book. But it took 7 years. And by the end of the 90s, as the book was coming out, his relationship with MI6 had pretty much broken down for a while. I mean, he was angry about the slowness, about the what was going to be released. He didn't like being edited and he didn't like having a co-author. He felt that this was his life's work and it wasn't being given the due weight. And his relationship actually really did kind of break down. I mean, MI6 would eventually assign a kind of very wise new officer to kind of rebuild that relationship. But I mean, at one point, he actually, when the book is about to come out, people had no idea about this in 1999, but he actually threatens to pull the plug on it. He says, I'd like to pull the plug on it. He says, I'm going to get lawyers to try and, stop this coming out because I don't want it to come out in this way. And, I'll kind of claim copyright over my files. And someone from MI6 did think to themselves, if anyone has copyright over this material, it's probably the KGB because it's their files. And he'd effectively stolen or copied them. But they don't say that to him. But, eventually, it does come out. So that process is difficult. But I think he felt that people hadn't understood what he was trying to do. So he was unsatisfied. I think one of the problems was, of course, as we discussed, he wanted the book to come out in Russia for the Russian people. And that did not happen. It was coming out in the West, being published in the West, and the West was interested in the Cambridge spies or what were the illegals up to in America or plans for sabotage in the West. Not the kind of talk about dissidence and spying on the Soviet Union's own people that Mitrokhin felt was important. So there was a fundamental tension there, I think. Additionally, by that stage, particularly around 1999, the Cold War seemed over. And not just over, but any sense of a threat from Russia or Russian intelligence seemed entirely historical. So people, again, just treated this as a bit of history. And yet, when you look at Mitrokhin's final writings in the last few years of his life, which I did, and you can find them in fragments in different places, you can see his fear that actually the KGB was not dead. And this, I think, was the tragedy of his last few years, is he could see something that almost no one else could see. He could see that this enemy that he'd fought hadn't died with the end of the Soviet Union, but had persisted and was coming back at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. And he could recognize that because, of course, he understood the KGB in a way that almost no one else in the world did. He'd been a KGB officer and he'd studied its archives and its history. He understood it with that kind of depth, which allowed him to say, it's not gone, it's coming back, you should be afraid. But I think he could see that very few other people were listening or could understand that in his final years in the early 2000s.
Yeah, a legacy that couldn't quite be recognized until a few years on.
Yeah, I feel like actually it's only today that you can understand how important a figure he was, because we now can look at his story in the light of what came after the publication of the archive in 1999, what came after his death in 2004, which is the rise of Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, and the resurgence of Chekist ideology.
Yep.
And I think, it's only now that his story looks much more interesting than I think it did in 1999 when he first came public. It has a much greater kind of salience and importance today.
Putin, a self-described Chekist, a term that he's embraced.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the, facts I love, I don't love, it's kind of so interesting is we talked about Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka. His statue is famously torn down in August 1991 in Moscow, outside the Lubyanka, outside KGB headquarters where it stood. But a couple of years ago, they put a new statue of Dzerzhinsky up, outside the Russian Foreign Intelligence, the SVR headquarters. You know, Dzerzhinsky is back. You know, this Chekist who founded the Cheka is back and being lauded and mythologized once again by Russian intelligence. So you can see the kind of continuity that exists there and which Mitrokhin understood and was writing about. The past was prologue for the Russia that is today. It's not quite the same, but it's rooted in that Chekist past.
This episode is brought to you by Stouffer's. Here comes 3-time juggling champion Natalia Rogers. She's juggling law school, her TA job. Oh, narrowly catches the laundry. What's that fourth ball? Parents unexpectedly showed up at dinner time? Is that too much for Natalia? Not with Stouffer's Chicken Alfredo and its mouth-watering mix of Asiago, Romano, and Parmesan. When you're juggling 4 things at once and the clock strikes dinner, think Stouffer's.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research process for the book and how you were able to source information? You know, I ask this because I know that there are a good handful of unnamed sources that are quoted in the text.
I'm afraid so. You know, I'd love to have cited a few more of the people I spoke to, but I think for reasons many listeners will understand, people spoke to me in many cases under strict agreement of anonymity. So one of the advantages I had was that the outlines of his story existed. The fact that he'd worked with British Secret Intelligence, MI6, actually was in the public domain. Because of the book in 1999, they'd actually kind of declared him, if you like, as someone they'd worked with, which is quite unusual for MI6. It's not something they normally do, which didn't then make it easier for people to talk and to be able to find information. There were some fragments in archives in places. Even the Australian archive, I found, you know, the kind of surveillance documents the Australian Security Service had put together for when he visited the Melbourne Olympics in 1956. There were bits that you could find there, but a lot of it came from people who'd known him and who'd worked with him over the years. And he was quite a solitary figure, and he, I don't think, wanted to talk that much about his own life. And so it's interesting that even with some of the kind of key moments, there were people who I thought would know those details who didn't, because he didn't want to talk about them. He didn't want to talk about why he'd been banished to the archives. He didn't want to talk about what he'd done in Ukraine as a prosecutor at the end of the Second World War. He was very kind of solitary and introverted, which did certainly pose some challenges. So it was a question of pulling it together by basically talking to a lot of people who knew him and piecing it together that way.
You're someone who has written and spoken about Cold War espionage for a long time now. And I'm curious if over the course of your career, or even if over just the last few years, you've noticed any kind of uptick in public curiosity about the motivations of maybe not just the KGB, but about the ideology that's shaped that agency and that is still evident in Russia today.
I think there is a bit, but I still don't think enough. When I started, late 90s as a journalist kind of covering this world, I think we did have a tendency to see the end of the Cold War as a kind of hard stop. And, all of this kind of Cold War spying stuff as archaic, and history. And it's only in the last few years that I think we've come to see the continuities between what Russia is doing today with its intelligence services and what it did in the past. And I include myself among some of the failings. But, if you want to understand, for instance, the kind of Russia murdering exiles like Alexander Litvinenko, which happened in Britain with radioactive polonium, famously in the mid-2000s. It's shocking, but if you know the history of the KGB, you know that going after exiles and critics abroad was absolutely part of the Chekist idea in the 20s and 30s, and of course even into the 40s. And you think of them going after Leon Trotsky in Mexico, famously, but lots of others as well. And maybe that diminished a bit in the Cold War, but it's still there. If you want to understand, there's so much interest at the moment in Europe about sabotage by the Russian intelligence services, thinking about cables being cut, arsons at warehouses with military equipment. Again, this is all in the KGB playbook. I mean, they did a lot of preparations for sabotage in the Cold War. And so the continuities are really interesting. But I think we've only just started to switch on to those and understand them. But I do think, to your point, that actually it's the mindset which is important to understand as well. And to understand, Vladimir Putin and those around him, as people who came, in many cases, almost all cases, came through the security and intelligence services and therefore were shaped by this Chekist ideology, and very explicitly so, and very explicitly use it and have used it to cement their positions in power. And it helps explain how they see the world. It helps explain how they see Ukraine. It explains why they carry out certain acts. And I think it is important to kind of grasp that. And I think we're doing it more now, but I think the more historical sense we have about that, the better.
I think you connect the dots so clearly and so compellingly, and it's a fascinating read. And as I said at the start, quite moving. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for chatting with me about it.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk about it. So thank you very much for your interest as well.
Thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between True Spies producer Morgan Childs and Gordon Corera. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
Chile could become communist. If it became communist, it could march up the continent. And people have forgotten all the struggles with Che Guevara in Bolivia. And there were real problems with the Cuban exportation of the revolution.
Richard Nixon believed that a communist takeover of Chile would create what he called a red sandwich in Latin America.
As a young person in Chile, I thought this struggle is going to go on for the rest of my life, but we're going to hold the line everywhere, and we're not going to see Latin American or Latin American friends under a communist system. And this was the core reason why there was an effort to try and block Allende.
Could Chile be the domino that toppled the democratic world? US leadership was determined not to find out.
True Spies, the classics. From SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, the holidays have come and gone once again, but if you've forgotten to get that special someone in your life a gift, well, Mint Mobile is extending their holiday offer of half off unlimited wireless. So here's the idea. You get it now. You call it an early present for next year. What do you have to lose? Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Limited time 50% off regular price for new customers. Upfront payment required. $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan. Taxes and fees extra. Speeds may slow after 50 gigabytes per month when network is busy. See terms.